This is Dr. Christopher Sernaque hosting episode 17 of season 6 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. Today we will be covering an event even rarer than the eclipse. Scientific American calls this a once-in-a-lifetime event. We'll also discuss the origin of life and discover why our sun is the best friend of the creationist model. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Audible, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Did you know that according to Bing's AI Copilot, in a typical lottery where you choose 6 numbers from a pool of 49, the chances of winning the jackpot, that's correctly selecting all 6 numbers drawn, are approximately 1 in over 139 million. So if you were to buy one lottery ticket each week, statistically speaking, you could expect to win the jackpot every 269,000 years. So while it seems like all bets are off at winning the lottery, now is your chance to experience a once-in-a-lifetime event. In March, Robin Andrews, a volcanologist and science writer, published this piece called "A Dead Star Will Soon Spark a Once-in-a-Lifetime Display in Earth's Skies." He explains, a nova called T Corona Borealis spectacularly erupts every 80 years. Your only chance to see it will come any day now. But just how likely are we to see this event? Andrew's article informs us TCrB last erupted in 1946, and its behavior suggests that its next paroxysm is due any moment between now and September. When this occurs, TCrB will become visible to the naked eye as a temporary jewel in the constellation's stelliferous crown, based on subtle details observed during its prior 2 recorded outbursts. The official prediction is that it'll go off around April, maybe May, give or take 3 months, and it should be visible for several days. If you're curious about how to see the nova, Space.com says this recurrent nova, which last exploded in 1946, is just one of 5 observed within the Milky Way galaxy. To spot the outburst, viewers should point their gaze to the Corona Borealis, which lies between the constellations Boötes and Hercules. The outburst will appear as a bright new star in the night sky. Generally, these binary stars have a magnitude of +10, which is far too dim to see with the unaided eye. However, during the outburst, the stellar system will have a magnitude of +2, which is comparable to the brightness of the North Star Polaris, according to the statement. Dr. Danny Faulkner, an astronomer of Answers in Genesis Ministries, says there is still much that we don't know about recurrent novae. Do they repeat their behavior so closely each time they erupt, or is each outburst unique in how it develops? We've only witnessed 2 eruptions, so we don't have enough information to know for sure whether the pattern repeats each time. We should keep in mind the disclaimer of investment opportunities. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Still, you might want to keep an eye on the constellation of Corona Borealis, the Northern Crown, this year to catch this relatively rare celestial event. It probably won't happen again in your lifetime. Dr. Faulkner's full article is linked in the description. He also has star charts links to his article, that way you and your loved ones can check out TCrB. And speaking of TCrB, Andrews quotes astrophysicist John Moores as saying, "Nova repeatedly and catastrophically erupt, somehow without destroying their stellar progenitors, all while enriching their celestial surroundings with a potent mix of fresh forged material. Nova are producers of elements needed for life, such as carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen." Andrews himself comments, "That suggests you can't fully understand how astrophysics gives rise to biology without decoding nova." In other words, many cosmologists, astrophysicists, astrobiologists, etc., subscribe to the view that the fundamental building blocks of life have been produced in space in some manner. I would respectfully disagree with this idea. There are several lines of evidence against the idea that life's building blocks came from space, specifically that supernovas are key to life's origin. Here's why. Supernovas are not a valid source of naturally occurring homochiral amino acids and thus do not help solve the origin of life problem. Well, what exactly is chirality? Dr. Sarfati explains, and this is taken from Evolution's Achilles' Heels. He says another problem with chemical evolution is called the chirality problem. Now, amino acids and proteins and sugars in DNA come in two mirror image forms, like your left hand and right hand, but all the amino acids in our body are left-handed, and all the sugars in DNA are right-handed. But a primordial soup would have an equal number of both, and it's quite complicated to get a single-handed mixture, and a primordial soup does not have that know-how and therefore is totally unsuitable for the origin of life. In other words, life needs both left-handed and right-handed amino acids to function, but it can't have them all jumbled up. So unfortunately for naturalistic ideas about the origin of life, according to Dr. Carl Wieland, amino acids in meteorites have been shown to be racemic, a 50-50 mix of both forms. But let's just say that there's some place out in space that has produced a non-racemic mixture. Would that get us any closer to generating life naturalistically? Once again, I'd have to say no. Here's why. Astrophysicist Joshua Howell states, while amino acids are the monomers needed to build proteins, 4 other monomers are needed to build the 3 other life-essential biomolecules, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. It's important to note that all the above compounds, while organic, are abiotic. They're non-living. So even if chemists were able to synthesize all of them from chemicals in the right amounts, they still could not claim a biogenesis is possible. On top of that, mathematician and astronomer Sir Fred Hoyle said, the likelihood of the formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 noughts after it. It's big enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. There was no primeval soup, neither on this planet nor any other. And if the beginnings of life were not random, they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence. So in other words, the TCrB display will be dazzling and beautiful, but it's not evidence of a naturalistic origin of life. One might wonder, although a supernova does not assist the naturalistic origin of life, does it fit within the creation model? Dr. Mark Harwood, a creation scientist, shared these thoughts. Is an exploding star consistent with a perfect creation? God said that the stars were created to be for signs and seasons, and God foreknew all that would happen right from the beginning. What to us seems to be destruction is actually just a physical process, which does not necessarily denote any lack of perfection in the original creation. Importantly, there's no loss of biblical life involved. The creatures affected by death, brought about by the fall, were those the Bible calls Nefesh Kaya. And speaking of stars, our sun is powerful evidence of the creation model. Dr. Jonathan Sarfati writes, recent research has called the sun exceptional. Our sun is among the top 10% by mass of stars in its neighborhood. It is actually an ideal size to support life on Earth. There'd be little point in having a red supergiant star like Betelgeuse because it is so huge that it would engulf all the inner planets. Nor would we want a star like the blue-white supergiant Rigel, 25,000 times as bright as the sun and emitting too much high-frequency radiation. Conversely, a star much smaller than our sun would be too faint to support life, unless the planet were so close to the star that there would be dangerous gravitational tides. So King David was right when he said, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament sheweth his handiwork. In them hath he set a tabernacle for the sun, which is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, and rejoices at the strong man to run a race. And finally, to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. You can find the articles referenced in this podcast episode, a discount link for the documentary Evolution's Achilles Heels, and a link to the Christ Jesus Ministries merch store in the description. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on iTunes, Audible, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.